Hi, welcome to this fifth clip of this week's lecture on culture. I say fifth because I'm hoping that you will have watched the Margaret Mead video that I put up on Moodle as a fourth clip. So I count this one as the fifth one. And this is the clip of criticisms. So as I did last week, so this week, and I'm probably going to continue doing it in future weeks, my last clip will also take a kind of critical take on the topic of the week, in this case culture. And I just want to remind you, of course, that we've already seen a major politically grounded criticism of Franz Boas in particular, and the whole school of thought of cultural anthropology that he begat, so to speak, in his teachings and through his students and so on, which was the critique advanced by Jobson in the Let Anthropology Burn article that we read a couple of weeks ago, where he takes Boas and his tradition to task for being too tame in their anti-racism and framing it within a kind of complacent liberalism that hasn't really made anywhere near the kind of difference to the constitution of the discipline as it should do. And this is kind of quite a major critique and intervention to make also in a kind of context of political activism today, which I think is really interesting to discuss. I want to add to that a number of other criticisms that one might make of the kind of culturalist approaches that we've been looking at today. And I want to start really with the fear of relativism that is often expressed when confronted with a culturalist approach in anthropology. This idea that the relativistic stance that it promotes of different worldviews, different perspectives on the world, each of them coherent and sensible in its own terms, refusing to make a judgment or to benchmark them against certain universal features and so on. That relativistic impulse, the cultural relativism that American cultural anthropology promotes, feels to some to be too permissive, too promiscuous even. Anything goes. How can we sustain such a relativistic position, not only from a moral point of view, because the moral relativism of cultural relativism is often kind of debated, so practices that might be deemed abominable or very difficult from a moral point of view, from the point of view of the culture, according to these terms, of the person studying, have to be understood in their own terms and made sense of, and that is deemed to be problematic or dangerous. But also from a kind of point of view of truth or epistemology, where does this relativism leave the project of science? What do we do with the idea of certain universal traits that's associated with human nature? Do we really want to throw away these touchstones of anthropological thinking in the name of relativism? So to give you an example, a very strong and buoyant current within anthropology today is called cognitive anthropology. I think I mentioned it before. And the basic idea there is that, sure, there is cultural variation, social variation. The way that people see the world differs from one place to another, from one time to another. But all that is only possible by virtue of what we have up here. Neuronal connections, grey matter, the way that our brain works. It's by virtue of having a brain, and by virtue of being members of our species, we have a particular kind of plasticity of brain. And it's that plasticity which allows for cultural variation to occur. So underpinning this cultural variation is a natural uniformity. And to relativize that would be to compromise the very project of understanding how human beings operate. So that would be one strong criticism from the universalists towards the relativists, so to speak, when it comes to culturalism. Another one is one that we've seen in relation also to the concept of society, which relates to the investment that both culturalism and kind of sociological approaches or society-based approaches invest in the idea of holism. So remember the idea of cultures have to be understood as wholes with parts that interconnect and mutually support each other in terms of their meaning, right? So you understand everything in its local context, and that local context formulates a configuration that we might call a culture, right? So where does one culture end and another one begin? one might ask, as one might ask, where does one society end and another one begin in relation to the topic of last week, right? So if you think, for example, of the kinds of arguments that we briefly touched upon in the last, in the third clip regarding Hurston's work or Herskowitz's work, they're talking about the cultural distinctiveness of African American culture. Okay, fair enough, but where do we draw the boundary? Is there a particular boundary that one can draw around African American culture and distinguish it from European American culture or Latin American or Latino American culture? Are these discrete things with borders? Surely that doesn't do justice to the dynamism, to the hybridity, to the multiplicity of these phenomena. So holism is problematic in that regard. Another question that has been made of these kinds of approaches is that of their kind of mentalistic quality, right? So culture is all about meaning, about interpretation. These are kind of mental types of phenomena. And one might ask, well, what about the body? What about materiality, right? So in this department, in UCL, as you know, we have a very strong tradition in the study of material culture, right? And that is partly born of a suspicion of this overemphasis on meaning as something that people carry in their communications, in language, in meaningful interactions, and a requirement to pay more attention to the materiality of human existence, right? And to the embodiment of human existence, right? So charging culturalism with being too mentally oriented is another line of criticism. Another line of criticism goes back to this question of politics with which I began. Marxist, anthropologist, post-colonial anthropologists or anthropologists influenced by post-colonial theory, feminist anthropologists have all drawn attention to the kind of anodyne, apolitical image that some of this kind of classical culturalism presents. Where's the inequality of human relationships? Where is the tension, the conflict that characterizes social relationships? What about exploitation, violence? All of this talk of culture seems to downplay or underplay the dynamic, conflict-ridden differentials of power that characterize cultural life. So again, kind of a political attack in this case. Or a politically oriented or motivated attack, which has profound implications for the kind of research projects that anthropologists pursue. Now, coming towards the end, I wanted to remind you of those two dirty words that I kind of put on the table from the first lecture already. Exoticism on the one hand and ethnocentrism on the other. And if you remember, I argued or suggested that exoticism is the kind of tendency or the kind of the sin, if you like, towards which relativistic approaches often tend, or the trap into which they can fall. If you're going to be emphasizing difference, as culturalist approaches do, then the danger is that you overemphasize this difference and you fall into representing the cultures that you're purporting to be interpreting in ways that exaggerate the difference from your own culture and make them seem alien. And that can easily fall into kind of rather old and still persisting tropes in the way that people think about foreigners that can end up being discriminatory or racist or depreciatory or neglectful in all sorts of ways of reflecting the humanity of the people that you're studying, right? And that is a common line of skepticism that can be expressed of kind of overly relativistic approaches. What I find interesting is that alongside that charge can go the charge with which I began this lecture in the first clip, which is that paradoxically, even though the tendency of a relativistic approach is to overemphasize difference, the way that difference is configured as this idea of the world being populated by different cultures, in the plurality of cultures, all of which have their equal worth and their right to exist and to express themselves, and we should appreciate them for what they are. That very much, for me, brings to mind a very kind of Euro-American political project, which is that of liberalism. There's something profoundly Western, liberal, democratic in the ethos of culturalists' relativism, in the way that it was pursued by Boas and that whole school, Clifford Geertz and so on. I think that is also the intuition that underlies Jobson's critique for this approach being too tame. But what I just wanted to draw your attention to is the potential for ethnocentrism, that baking in this kind of liberal premise into the project of anthropology runs. The risk of ethnocentrism runs deep here, right? I personally feel uncomfortable about the prospect of an anthropology that effectively kind of plays itself out as a kind of Occidental liberal project. Not because I'm against liberalism, I'm perfectly fine with liberalism at a political level, but because as an anthropologist, I want to remain sensitive to the possibility of alternative ways of construing possibilities for human life. And I don't want to encage them within a kind of comfortable liberal sensibility, which is the kind of ethnocentric danger that I would detect in this approach. So I think I'll leave it there. It's been, again, a very rich topic to discuss and plenty to go into. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you. And I really look forward to seeing you all in class, where we can discuss all of this in even greater detail, and I can hear what you all make of it.